In this video, I explain to you how you can take most acrylic paints and thin them to become airbrush paints. So when you start airbrushing, frequently you buy a kit, and it will come with a hose and some paints and some thinner, or stuff to clean the airbrush or whatever. You get things kind of in a whole bundle. And in many situations, the paints that will come with it are already designed to go into an airbrush. They're already kind of pre-thinned so they can be fired through an airbrush. So why can't you just take your normal, Citadel paints straight out of the pot, put them into your airbrush, and fire them through properly? Well, it has to do with viscosity. If the paint is too thick, it won't get through the brush over the course of the needle with the air behind it and become atomized and shot out all over whatever model you're working on. If it's just too gloppy, which is not a technical term, but if it's too gloppy, it just won't go through the airbrush. There's nothing you can do about it. So you have to fluidize it, that's also not a technical term, to make it so that it goes through the airbrush more easily, becomes atomized, and adheres properly to the model that you're spraying it at. Now understand, in most situations, if you are using a paint designed for airbrush, like Vallejo Model Air, Vallejo Game Air, I know Reaper has some air, I think Reaper has some brush or some paints that will work in air. They're designed for it. Scale 75, even Citadel has recently released a set of airbrush paints. They just come in those dumb little pots, and it's really hard to get them into the airbrush. But the whole trick is that those are designed to be pre-thinned kind of, and they're designed to go through the airbrush. Normal paints, normal acrylics, which are generally a bit thicker, are not. So you have to thin them to make them more viscous, less viscous. I was never super good in science. Now, acrylics are technically water soluble, so you could just add water to your paint to get it to be more watery and then spray it through your airbrush. And some people just are completely happy to do that, and that's fine. There are some issues that will come from that. You should probably not use tap water in these situations. Distilled water is better because it doesn't have all the mineral impurities and all that junk already in it. So you're in a situation where you're putting yourself behind the 8-ball by trying to fire stuff through your airbrush, but also having weird mineral deposits from the pipes in your house, also trying to be fired through that same brush. I don't personally like to use water because what it does is it has a tendency to thin the pigment within the substrate that holds it, which is the acrylic. It has a tendency to make it a little spottier sometimes. I have trouble with other things with it. Sometimes it makes depending on the color, the tip of the brush, the airbrush, will dry more frequently, and then it just causes problems when you're trying to spray. So I don't generally use water, distilled or otherwise, for thinning. I generally use some other types of products. Now a note, just FYI, this is how I do it. I'm no airbrush scientist, so you may do some more research online and figure things out, but this is how I do it, and so I'm going to tell you how I do it. Generally, when I want to take a paint that is not designed to go into an airbrush and put it through an airbrush, I use something like an airbrush thinner. This is Vallejo Airbrush Thinner, and it's designed to basically do just that. I don't exactly know what's in it, but I have some suspicions. I'm pretty sure that there's probably a flow aid in there. What that does, there's flow aid and there's drying retarder, and they're kind of related, but they're not exactly the same. Flow aid helps surface tension break a little bit easier, more often than not, and drying retarder does pretty much what it says in the tin. It makes it takes longer for the paints to dry. Drying retarder is cool in airbrushing because then you don't have a tendency to get the tip to dry on your airbrush when you're spraying it as frequently, which is nice because for any of you that have been doing it for a while, especially if you're using like a really light color like a white or a bone, the pigments have to be bigger, I believe, to make that kind of material be as bright as it is, so they dry on the tip more frequently, and you start spraying, and then eventually you just start doing the bubbly thing coming out of the top of your airbrush. Like when you were a kid and you used to blow bubbles in chocolate milk, it starts to do that at the top of your airbrush. That's a bad sign, so you don't want that. It's usually because your tip is clogged. Now another thing that I also sometimes use, I kind of go back and forth, I also use something called golden airbrush medium. Now you'll notice in here, this kind of looks like Maybe you can see this, maybe you can't, but it looks kind of like milk. That's sort of important. Anytime that you are trying to thin normal acrylic paints to become airbrush paints, I've heard this time and time again on bunches of different blogs and podcasts and all this, you want to get the paint consistency to that of milk. You want to, like, if you were to take a little bit of milk in a cup and move it around, and then take a little bit of your paint and move it around, and they kind of acted the same, then you're on. But if this is still a little too sort of, gloppy, and then, yeah, you want to add a little bit more thinner. When you add water as your thinner, you are basically also reducing the amount of pigment in the overall fluid, and that can make, in some situations you want that because you want to almost glaze with your airbrush, but in a lot of situations you're trying to actually get some coverage. So that's one of the reasons why I prefer something like thinner, or in some situations, something like airbrush medium. Now this kind of stuff, I mean, obviously this is hard to get into your airbrush. So what I frequently do is I like to mix or pre-mix bottles of color. I will take whatever color I'm working on. When I did my Black Templar back in the day, I would prime them black, and then I would kind of dust them from above with a highlight of a very dark gray, but not black. And I would pre-mix it in bottles like this. You can get bottles like this at pretty much any craft store. I got these at Hobby Lobby. I bought a whole bunch of them. So I would put in some of the medium, I'd put in a little bit of thinner because I like to cover both my bases, and then I would put in X amount of black, a little bit of white, and I would get this color. I would write on the bottle, this is the highlight color for my Black Templars, and I would keep it. It'll separate almost every time. If you've taken a couple of days and come back, it'll separate. So you just shake it up real good, and then you're set. So that's something to think about when you have decided this is the color I need for this army. Pre-mix a whole bunch of it in a bottle like this, and it will help you a ton. The trick about thinning your paints, there's no hard and fast rule. There's no like, oh, it's 50% this to 50% that, or 33% this to 66. I mean, no one can really tell you, unfortunately, because there are so many different paints out there. And even if you're using a very popular paint, if you're using like a Citadel, like, I don't know, I can't remember what any of the colors are called anymore because they've changed them so many times. But if you use some Citadel paint that everybody uses, if that paint's old-ish, it will not take thinner as easily as paint that's new, or it'll require more thinner. You could have a pot of paint, take a bunch out, mix it with some thinner, get exactly what you want with a little bit of trial and error, you're happy. You come back in a year and try to mix up that exact same number and ratio, and it won't work because your acrylic has sat for a year now and it's probably thickened up a little bit. So you always want to really go for that milk consistency. Slosh it around inside the bottle and look and see, what is it doing? Is it like milk? Is that anything like milk? Would I drink that? Don't drink that. Just by the way, don't drink that. But the trick is that the milk consistency is what you're looking for. You're not looking for a Kool-Aid consistency. That is probably not going to do you much good, all right? So if it's basically just like purple or blue or green or orange water, it's probably not going to do much. You're going to spray and not see anything happen. That's why I can't, I've tried to spray washes, like a normal, Games Workshop wash through an airbrush, and it just doesn't do much. If you're trying to get a wash effect with an airbrush, I'd tell you to look at inks. I know Sam likes to use FW inks through an airbrush to kind of help make things a little bit darker. What else? I would say probably like secret weapon washes would also be good through an airbrush, I think, for something like to darken up a vehicle or some terrain. But for paints, for the normal stuff that you've been sitting on, you've got this pot of whatever color and you want to blow it through your airbrush so that you can do an entire army quick, which is a great idea. Airbrushing makes big army painting go a lot faster. It's going to take a little bit of work. You want to do a little bit of practice and get your consistency with your thinner or your big old jug airbrush medium. Get your consistency of your paint to that of milk, and you won't have any problems, probably.